Good afternoon. I'm Cadet First Class Kelly Yoon, and it's my privilege to welcome you to this 31st Annual National Character and Leadership Presentation. Our honored guest for this afternoon's session is Mr. Warren Acuncius. Warren Acuncius serves as the team lead for the Civil Military Disaster Operations Division, U.S. Agency for International Development. As the former lead U.S. IndoPacific Command Humanitarian Assistance Military Advisor, he was awarded the Department of Defense's Joint Civilian Service Commendation Award. Furthermore, as a Technical Operations Branch Chief, he coordinated the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, Chemical, Biological, Radiological, Nuclear, and High-Yield Explosives portfolio. Moreover, Warren was a Johns Hopkins Emerging Leader and Biosecurity Fellow. In addition to these primary duties, he facilitates Joint Humanitarian Operations Courses, educating American military colleagues on the U.S. government's best practices, policies, and procedures for conducting overseas humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. He has taught these courses in academic and diplomatic settings around the world and for the UN Civil Military Coordination Course for an international audience. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Warren Acuncius.
It was the day before the disaster, April 24th, 2015, and I had just been handed the keys to my first house, just outside of Washington, D.C., just past the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The plan was the 25th, Saturday, in the morning, my dog, Black Lab Hudson, and I would get out of bed, we'd unpack some boxes, and just settle in. Instead, on the morning of the 25th, I rolled over in bed, opened my news app on my phone, and at the very top read, 7.8 earthquake, 9 miles deep, Kathmandu, Nepal, just northwest of the city. I had been there just 6 months earlier on vacation. So within a few hours, I was inside of USAID's Operations Center trying to figure out if there was humanitarian need for this crisis. I knew I had at least a long weekend ahead of me. So by 7 o'clock, I tried to pace myself, started packing up my bags to go home, to go grab Hudson from my friend's house. And my boss came to me and he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'll be back first thing in the morning, I promise. Just got to go take care of a couple things." He said, "No, you have 3 hours to be on a bus to Dover Air Base. You're going to Kathmandu." So in this moment, I did the most sensible thing anybody could possibly do. I called my ex-girlfriend. She came and picked me up from the Operations Center. She went and grabbed Hudson. She took me home where I frantically went through boxes looking for my kit, and she made me 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. By the way, my ex-girlfriend is in the audience today, just so you know. She drove me out to our urban search and rescue facility. I got on the bus just in time to get to Dover, where I flew out on a C-17 to Kathmandu. And yes, by the way, my ex-girlfriend is now my wife. Thank you. She's somewhere around here with my son, Weston, so if you hear a crying baby, that might be him just cheering me on. And I'm not saying those peanut butter and jelly sandwiches were deal makers, but we're married now, so all's going well. I want to start this conversation a little bit different. I want you to envision what it's like to go and respond to a disaster and assess need. With the humanitarian response team hat on, I want to start the conversation about Nepal. I want to do a windshield assessment with you. I want you to look at some pictures. I want you to ask questions like, what's needed? What are the challenges here? Who should be providing aid? As you walk down the streets of Kathmandu, this is a pretty common scene. So just look at this for a second. Are there people buried in that building? How are we going to access these places? Who's going to clean this up? Do they need shelter, food, water, basic medical care? Is that urban search and rescue team I mentioned a valuable asset here? Are there NGOs that are operating here that can help? This picture I took 6 months earlier on vacation. It was a building just across from my hotel. And if you can see this well enough from where you're sitting, you'll notice that right between the first and second floor, there are 2x4s holding this building in place. This is not a 2-story building, this is a 4-story building. You know where I'm going with this. It was the first place I visited when I got back. When you see this, you might look and say, well, what are the building standards and codes in this place? Are they like mine in America? No, they may not be. What is the quality of living? What is the standard of living? It's different in these places that we go. We can't take our assumptions about what right looks like, because this is just the reality of where these people live. If you walk further through Kathmandu, you inevitably come to Durbar Square. It is a historic and economic center of the city. Again, you know where this is going, right? These buildings that stood for hundreds of years came down. And with it, that history, with it, that culture, and with it, tourists that might bring dollars that can be put into the local system. If you're lucky enough to get on a helo and fly around Kathmandu, you will notice that it is a very densely populated city. There's not a lot of green space, maybe a golf course by the airport, maybe this field here, and of course with seismic activity, in a location like this, densely packed, you get the movement of people. Who will provide them shelter? Who will provide food, water, sanitation, basic medical? Maybe there's an NGO, maybe a United Nations organization can help. And as those aftershocks start to slow down and people feel a little more confident, they might go back into their home. And then that next aftershock, they come right back out. Who's going to be there for the length of time it is required to keep these people alive? Now, for just a second, imagine your hometown. And imagine you have an earthquake or some kind of disaster that occurs. You come outside and you see a foreign military walking down your street. You hear foreign languages being spoken. You see the media everywhere. This can be a very overwhelming space for people who just went through crisis. These people are all well-meaning. They're trying to help. But it can also add to the stress of these situations. And inevitably, you'll come across the host nation, ultimately responsible for their people. Now, we're there providing aid to the people going through crisis, but we work with the host nation. They're allowing us to come in and provide assistance. And you might ask yourself a question: how good are they at domestic response? The Nepalese are quite good, but this disaster rose to the level requiring outside assistance. We can talk about countries like Japan, which are exceptional at domestic response, but it's pretty hard to get through a triple disaster like 3/11 when you have an earthquake, a tsunami, and a nuclear meltdown. There is no country in the world, including ours, that at one point or another will not need help. I put this picture in here for a couple of reasons. One, to identify the fact that in the Nepal earthquake, the US military came to support, and it was phenomenal. 36 CRG Contingency Response Group out of Guam arrived with 28 people, medical, engineers, pilots. They maintained the runway at night so that airplanes could land during the day. It's amazing. They're opening up the system for all the international community to provide assistance. We also had the Marine Corps flying Huey and Osprey missions for us, further reaching people that were in remote locations on top of mountains that were cut off because their roads washed away. Second reason I love this picture, if you look past those DoD assets, you can see 2 or 3 other planes with flags from other countries. Now, number one, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, is a bipartisan issue in this country. We have bipartisan support from our Republican and Democratic colleagues. Internationally, this may be one of the only places that you will ever sit next to other countries' militaries to collaborate and work together. It's pretty amazing to see. Different motivations can have shared outcomes. And regardless of our sometimes inconsistent diplomatic relationships, we can actually work with these countries. And I can't talk about Nepal without mentioning what happened just a few weeks after the initial earthquake. That was an aftershock at 7.3 magnitude. All those people who came days and weeks after the initial shock were now first responders, to include our military colleagues, flying missions out to remote locations to bring people who are injured back to Kathmandu to receive medical care. And on that day, we lost Vengeance 1, a Marine Corps helicopter with all the Marines, all the Nepalese army, and all the civilians on board. it is a reminder that this is inherently an insecure space. Even in permissive environments, these jobs are dangerous. And we have to make sure we have the mentality of safety and security when we operate in the space. So this is Nepal, 2015. 9,000 dead, 22,000 people were injured, 600,000 structures were partially or totally destroyed. This was Nepal. But honestly, it really could have been anywhere. We are so inundated in the news with humanitarian crises that we don't often even recognize that they are occurring, or many times we forget that they even happened in the first place, even if they're ongoing. We're talking about what we see in the media and on the news headlines now between Israel and Gaza. We see it in Syria, South Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen. It's the 1-year anniversary of the Syria and Turkey earthquake. It's the 10-year anniversary of the West Africa Ebola outbreak. These are happening all the time. And either we are so inundated we don't see them, or we never hear about them. A couple of stats. 1 out of 23 people in the world will need humanitarian assistance this year. 1 out of 23 people. 1 out of 73 people will be forcibly displaced from their home. 1 out of 5 children is either living in or fleeing conflict. I hope you weren't expecting a motivational speech. This is really depressing stuff. But there is a community that works to help these people. We're going to talk about that community. That's the goal. But before we do that, before we tell you about the culture and the community of these people who help those in crisis, we have to do a little bit of academics here. I'm sorry, this is a traditional slide. We're going to baseline what we're talking about. You can divide disasters into 2 categories, man-made and natural. We further break these down into complex emergency, slow onset, and rapid onset. So let's talk about those just quickly so you understand what that means. Complex emergencies, as indicated on the slide in front of you, are your civil wars, your politics, your guns, your people killing each other. Man-made, these are disasters. These are humanitarian crises. You often have the permanent movement of people fleeing for their life, either trapped inside that country, IDPs, internally displaced persons, or they're crossing a border and they're refugees. We're going to come back to this in a second because I want you to put on a different hat. These complex emergencies are growing in number and they are protracted. They are lasting longer and longer. And not only do they affect the countries that you see in red, they also affect bordering countries. Many of these disasters flow over into other places, if not through the refugee populations, then through the crisis themselves. Disasters do not respect state boundaries, unfortunately. And indeed, in these instances, it is not only the countries that are highlighted on the map, it is the whole world. Middle-income and low-income countries take in 76% of the refugee population, adding stress to an already stressed system. Second kind of disaster are slow onset, and you can see these happen pretty infrequently, but enough that we need to prepare for them in a special way. These are cyclical, often natural disasters like drought, which could lead to famine. Or it could be an infestation of locusts eating crops. You have people moving because the source they need to survive is gone. That movement of people, again, adds complications. We're going to talk about more of that in a second. And finally, the most traditional of all disaster types, rapid onset. This is your CNN, Fox News moment, right? This is the earthquake, the tsunami, the volcano, the wildfire that occurs. Often natural, no-notice events where people move out of the way, ultimately to come back to where they started. They want to be home. They just need to find a safe place for a little bit. This traditionally was what we responded to the most. Now we're seeing about a 50-50 split between the rapid onset and the complex emergencies. So let's go back to those rapid onset disasters for just a moment. I'm going to stay here. Imagine that you are that refugee, right? You had that hat on as a humanitarian responder before. Now put yourself in the position of somebody who has gone through a crisis. The day before the disaster, everything is fine, and then war breaks out. For whatever reason, you fear for your life. You fear persecution. You fear that somebody will identify you and target you based on your race, religion, or otherwise. And so you make a bold decision. You pack 2 bags, the most valuable things you have. You grab your 2 kids' hands, And if you're lucky enough and close enough to a border, you cross that border. And if you're lucky enough, a UN agency will come along and designate you as a refugee. You don't get to call yourself one. It is an official designation that comes with protections and resources. So maybe you're away from that country, your home nation, where the war has broken out. You're in a new country within communities that may not like that you're there. There might be tensions. Now, again, as a refugee, you're provided certain protections, certain resources. So let's talk about what that looks like for just a second. I actually brought my son's toys to sort of designate an area to show you this a little better. We have a lot of minimum standards in the humanitarian world. One of them is minimally adequate space. That means what is the minimum amount of space that we need to provide to somebody to keep them safe, healthy, surviving? Minimally adequate space in the humanitarian community is set at 3.5 square meters. This will be a little better visual, I promise. All right, I'm spitballing here. Maybe we'll move this over just a little bit. 3.5 square meters. This is minimally adequate space. This may be what you're provided as a refugee. It's 37 square feet. A queen-size bed is 33 square feet. It's not a lot of space. Now, maybe you're saying, well, as a refugee, you won't be here for very long, right? On average, a refugee is titled that or in that position for an average of 20 years. IDPs, those that are stuck inside of the borders of their own country, 10 years. This minimally adequate space is what you have for who knows how long. Now, roll out your bed, roll. Set down those 2 bags you had. Maybe a bag of food, maybe a non-food item kit with your pots and pans. This is what you're left with. And for an unknown amount of time. So let me try this for a second. I'm going to just kind of estimate here, but I'm going to ask everybody in this first section, just raise your hand. Just hold it up there for a second. I promise this won't be long. If we envision that this entire audience is 100% of the people who required shelter last year, 4% would get what they need. The rest of you, good luck. Maybe a mosque, maybe a church, maybe a neighbor will take you in. You're the fortunate ones, and the rest of you are out on your own. You can put your hands down. Thank you. Appreciate it. It's a pretty tough situation. Well, so what do you do? If you're stuck in this situation, you have 3 options as a refugee. They're called durable solutions. Your first option is that you voluntarily return to the country that you came from. That's pretty tough if there's a war going on. 2, you resettle in the place that you're at. Also, again, maybe there are tensions. That community has to welcome you. Maybe you receive commodities and life-saving aid that the locals don't get. Imagine that dynamic. Or if you're lucky, you might get to resettle. 1, you don't get to pick the country that you resettle to. 2, you might not even speak the language. And 3, let's say you're lucky enough to come to the United States, 2-year process, that you'll be staying in this situation until you get processed. All right, I said it was depressing stuff. But we're getting into the community here in just a second. So let's talk a little bit more about the origin story and who the community really is. I'm going to leave this blank for just a second. The humanitarian community does not have one standout all-star. There is no GOAT, right? There's no Tom Brady, if you agree with that argument, or Michael Jordan. It's made up of a lot of people who have paved the path for us. For example, we're talking about people maybe you've heard of, like Florence Nightingale, who improved British hospitals for British soldiers. Harriet Tubman, who fought for better hospitals in the Civil War. Clara Barton, created the American Red Cross. Herbert Hoover, one of my favorite humanitarian authors, Hugo Slim, says that Herbert Hoover is the greatest Western humanitarian of all time because he industrialized aid and he saved hundreds of millions of lives. You've heard of all of them. There's one name that maybe you haven't heard of that also had a significant role. So this is also part of our origin story. This is Henry Dunant, Swiss businessman who wanted to hold council with Napoleon III. Turns out Napoleon was busy with a battle coming up in northern Italy. So Dunant decides to go and meet him where he is. He arrives on June 24th, 1859, to the Battle of Solferino. Dunant witnesses 23,000 men dead, dying, or wounded. Up to 40,000 if you count those that are missing. So Dunant sets out to the local community and basically gathers any volunteers, mostly women and young girls, and they go onto the battlefield without picking a side, and they simply help people. They clean wounds, they provide food, water, and they write letters home. Dunant walks away from this a changed man. Those business holdings he wanted to talk about, he forgets about them. He sets off to writing a book called A Memory of Solferino. And this book is significant because it actually instigates a lot of changes in how we do what we do, to include the military. The Geneva Convention, international humanitarian law are all influenced by Dunant and his book. The creation of the largest humanitarian organization in the world, the Red Cross, comes from Dunant's book. And in 1901, he wins the very first Nobel Peace Prize that he shares with another gentleman. At some point, Hollywood, if you're listening, you need to make a movie about this man. He's pretty interesting. One other thing, especially significant from Dunant in his book, the humanitarian principles. So I have spoken to a lot of people prior to coming to this event and asked, do the cadets know what the humanitarian principles are? And I was told that at one point or another in your academic careers here, you will in fact learn about this in one context or another. So, by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the humanitarian principles? Okay. So either some of you are asleep or you've just never heard of them. Either way, we were going to baseline them anyways. So let's talk about these principles because these are the values of the community that we're talking about today. They are humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And these four principles simply say we will provide aid where it is needed. We will not be biased on your race, gender, religion, or otherwise. We will not pick sides in battles. If you need aid on either side, we will help you. And we will stay away from outside persuasions, political and otherwise. The principles are important because they are the cornerstone and the foundation of the humanitarian community. They are also the trust that we build with the communities that we work with. They're not only the trust, they are the security. Humanitarians do not carry weapons. We use our principles to work with communities that we have built trust with. So these are very, very important to us. They are the foundation of what we do and what we believe. I'm going to pull up part of this slide. I would challenge you to find any other instance professionally where you have NGOs, UN, Red Cross, donors, governments, individual donors, private sector, militaries, and many more all working for the same outcome. This is maybe the most unique community in the world. And many of you in this audience may actually be a part of this at some point. We have NGOs, non-governmental organizations. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way. There are millions of them out there. You have the UN and the Red Cross in the bottom left, these international organizations that support. And it's a community that is expeditionary. It's flexible, it's culturally sensitive, it is a brave community. It is operational, it is professionalized. You might hear that and identify with it because guess what? In many cases, the US military has a lot of these same characteristics. We have challenges in our community for sure. Accessing a lot of these places is very challenging. The funding we need to provide the assistance to everybody is very challenging. We also have morale issues because we work in really hard places. And there's no end of the day where we say, we won. There's also another part of this community that I want to mention. I'm going to get to them in here in just a second. And that is of the donors and the governments that work here. Because this organization needs to be funded somehow. And most traditionally, we see that coming from what we call traditional donors. We also see it from individual donors, and we see it from folks like you who contribute to non-governmental organizations. But these donors play a pretty big role in empowering and enabling this community. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are a lot of countries who are coming into this space recently, and many who have been here for a very long time, all trying to find a way to help people in crisis. There's one on here that's missing, clearly, because you don't see an American flag. And that's because I want to take a second to actually talk about how the US government provides humanitarian assistance as a donor. USAID, my employer, the US Agency for International Development, is the largest humanitarian contributor in the world. $15 billion last year to humanitarian aid. Within the agency, there's one bureau that I work for, the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, that contributed 10 of that $15 billion. And US government funding covered about 35% of the entire humanitarian budget globally last year. We are a key player in enabling those communities to do more. So I want to talk about the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance for just 1 second. BHA has a mission that is drilled into us from the very beginning: save lives, alleviate suffering, and reduce the economic and social impacts of a disaster. Save lives mean pulling bodies from buildings. We have 2 urban search and rescue teams that are internationally qualified in the US, only 2, to deploy internationally and provide humanitarian assistance. One in Fairfax County, Virginia, one in LA County as well. Firefighters by day, international USAR by night. Alleviate human suffering we can do through our many commodities that we have in warehouses around the world, food and non-food aid. And reducing the impacts of humanitarian crises, we can actually set up programming during and after disasters to address some of the social and economic impacts of that event. We do this through 3 different mechanisms. One is funding, which we talked about, $10 billion last year, fairly significant. The commodities that I mentioned, and also the personnel. We have 2 teams that respond to disasters. One is called a DART. It's the tip of the spear. Appropriate visual, right? Disaster Assistance Response Team. The DART is the field deployed staff like I was in Nepal. They go out, assess need, figure out ways to help, and ultimately support the people going through crisis. The other team is a response management team, RMT, back in Washington, D.C. So we have 2 teams of people that parallel each other, working on field-based decision-making to support those people going through crisis. It's a pretty cool system to watch. The other piece of this that makes it kind of neat is that we are actually the lead federal coordinator for disaster response in the US government. We do this about 70 times a year, and you probably never hear about them either. On occasion, you might hear in the media that we're providing humanitarian assistance to Gaza, South Sudan, Yemen, or other places. But very rarely do you know where it comes from. And by and large, it is BHA at the US Agency for International Development. As the lead federal coordinator, it is partially our responsibility to identify unique capacities in the US government that can provide aid in unique situations. Guess who one of our best partners is? Department of Defense brings unique capabilities to humanitarian response. We have a system that works very well, where we get to request through the Secretary of Defense that the DoD put down its primary mission and pick up a humanitarian mission in support of the civilian agency. So we actually have to go to your boss's boss's boss to say, is it okay if we steal some of your men and women in uniform to help us? And by and large, we get a yes. The DoD is enthusiastic to help. When the DoD does this, it only happens about 10% of the time for us, but that means that's 5, 6, 7 disasters a year the DoD is coming in and providing aid. And when it works, it is phenomenal to watch. I'm going to show you a picture, but in 2 slides, there's one that really represents it all for me. We're going to talk about how you can help other people. So, I teach a 2-day class to US military. I've done it at Northcom, I've done it around the world, and I do 16 hours of content with the US military. I'm taking 16 hours of content and I'm going to shove it into 2 minutes. So bear with me. There are a lot of best practices. After doing CivMil work, the USAID and the DoD working together, we have learned a lot of lessons. And I've highlighted a few of them on the screen for you here. We're going to talk about these just briefly. What is unique capacity? Unique capacity means that the Department of Defense is going to come support a response by doing something that nobody else can do. Maybe that something is just temporary. Maybe the World Food Program can come in because they're pretty good at logistics, but maybe they're not available. Or maybe there's just no capacity. So what does unique capacity look like? Oftentimes it is logistics. Oftentimes it is port management, runway maintenance like the CRG, 36 CRG in Nepal. It might be transloading, offloading commodities from planes, not just our own, but others. It might be moving humanitarian personnel and commodities from one location to remote mountaintop villages in Nepal. It's pretty cool to watch this happen. The other thing, and the one that I was sort of alluding to, was the concept of wholesale, not retail. We want DoD to come in and not only help the DoD in the humanitarian crisis, not only help the US government and USAID, we want the DoD to engage and help the entire international community do more for people. So this picture, which is one of my favorites, because it has a story, is Haiti 2010. You have a special operations group here, US Air Force, and they were called in to help manage the runway. In Haiti, there were 230,000 people that lost their lives. 300,000 people needed humanitarian assistance. And these folks came in with a card table and a walkie-talkie and took an airport, Port-au-Prince Airport, which on an average day landed 35 planes a day, to 200, sometimes 240 planes a day. 6 minutes. That's how quickly they were landing planes. One plane every 6 minutes. What does that do for the international community that needs to help 300,000 people? It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. That is wholesale, not retail. We don't want the DoD or even USAID engaging directly with beneficiaries. We want that to be localized and coming from NGOs and people who live in those communities. But we together can enable a wholesale response that helps hundreds of thousands of people. The other piece here is cultural context, and I'm going to hit on this again in a second because it is important. We make a lot of assumptions when we go into other places, whether it's quality of life or standards of living, or how they operate or what they want, or how they might do it. Truly, we have like this hero's mentality where we run in and we're going to save the day, and we have many times forgotten just to engage that local population. What do you need? How would you do it? We've also seen many instances where that local community couldn't even absorb the capacity of the US government. Dirt runways, no elevators, nothing to help offload. We've made a lot of bad assumptions in the past. We have learned from our mistakes. So we talk about the cultural context and being aware of that local population because we are there to help them. And the last one I have for you is do no harm. And I put this on here in part because I flash back to Vengeance 1 and my experience in Nepal. Do no harm is a common phrase for a lot of professions. But not only does it mean do no harm to the people that you're providing assistance to, it also means do no harm to yourself. We'll be in these situations, and we may provide aid. That aid may take away a job from somebody else. How do we not do that? How do we make sure that everything we do is a total positive? And I put this picture on here. This is from Pakistan in the floods. And you can see that this is chaos, right? This is going in without a plan. You see the gentleman in the bottom right, strongest and the fastest. He's gotten what he needs. Probably the slowest and the weakest who we're trying to help will not get what they need. Not only do you have people that are put in danger in this situation, and I have been in the middle of these experiences, you're also putting that crew, those people responding to help in harm's way. And just like Vengeance 1 and other instances like this, bad things have happened. Okay, so those are my big key lessons learned. 16 hours in 2 minutes, 3 minutes maybe. I want to close this out with just giving you a couple of the best practices or the lessons learned that I have experienced over 16 years of doing international and domestic response work. Some of these will be applicable to you. Maybe they apply to military work. Maybe they don't. But either way, I want to share with you some of the things I've learned. Number one, disasters are snowflakes. You can have the same event in one country, 1 year apart, and they will look like very different experiences. We cannot make assumptions when we do this work. Disasters that are snowflakes are also sticky, though. We learn from them. This community is small. What happens in one disaster response will surely carry over to another. What you do in this event is not siloed. People will remember. good or bad, often the bad. So if you find yourself supporting these situations, remember that we are being watched and that people will learn from what we do, for better or for worse. The next one is localization, localization, localization. And it goes back to that cultural context we talked about. This is a new key term for the humanitarian community. We want to localize disaster. What can we do to empower the locals to prepare for disaster, to respond themselves, to help their own community? And maybe, if we prepare them well enough, that crisis that we would have come in to respond to doesn't need outside help. Localization is an ideal that we are working towards, and I think these communities are welcoming it wholeheartedly. Leadership is not always about leading. In a community that does not have C2, like you have C2, right? You have command and control, you have a boss, he or she tells you what to do, you do it. Our C2 is collaboration and coordination. We work at a round table where nobody sits at the head. The NGO community are all collaborative and work with one another. So we don't really have a leader, per se. We have individual leaders who work together and complement each other. So you do not always need to be at the head of the table in this community to show your leadership. This picture, by the way, is from West Africa, Ebola. It's about 10 years ago. This was a hospital that we had built to encourage doctors from other countries to come in and help us fight Ebola. There weren't enough doctors in the country. So we said to these doctors, if you come in, we will provide you American care. And you can see as people survived, they put their hand on the wall, but not everybody survived. Direction over speed. Probably not surprised, given what happened in Nepal. We want to make sure we have a plan when we do what we do. There's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek saying, don't just stand there, do something. I have learned that sometimes you don't just do something, stand there. Give it a second, and analyze the situation, have a good plan. Make sure that you are safe when you provide assistance and you execute that plan. Direction over speed. And the last one before we close out, you cannot do without those before you and beside you. Those of you that are part of this academic community, you have people, amazing people that came before you. I've had the luxury of sitting around for this week in classes, engaging students, seeing how your lives are in the dorms. This culture, these systems that you enjoy were built by the people before you. Show them gratitude. This is an amazing place. The other thing is, don't forget your peers. Side by side, these are the people you work with. Appreciate them because you will not be able to accomplish the mission without them. And I see Kelly. She's going to cut me off in a second. I'm going to make this short, I promise. Where are we headed? The UN estimates that next year there will be 300 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. We will target 180 million. It will cost us $46 billion. Just to put your mind in the right phase here. 300 million people that need aid, that's just south of the population of the United States. There will be a gap of 120 million people needing assistance that won't get it. Humanitarians are also trying to do more than save lives. We're looking at mental health, climate adaptation. We are challenged by insecurity, new actors trying to influence what we do, new technologies. So what's the bluff? It's an uphill battle. I know, it's depressing. You probably wanted me to motivate you, but this is the reality of what's going on out in the world. We are looking for good people like you to come and support us in uniform or be part of our community when you're a civilian to help people in crisis back to the day before the disaster. Thank you.
Warren, thank you for your message this afternoon. At this time, I would like to open the floor to questions.
I have silenced you all.
I have a question over here. Perfect. Can you talk about best practices for quickly establishing cultural context when speed is a necessity?
Yeah, absolutely. The partnerships that we have with non-governmental organizations, the UN, the Red Cross, many of those, as we talk about localization, are already there. The way we work so successfully with partners is because we've worked with them for decades. We don't just hand out money to partners because they say we need the money, we can do things. We actually have a long process of validating them. And as soon as a crisis happens, the US government has the access of the embassy that has some cultural context. But we also have the resources of our partners who we've worked with for decades that can tell us, this is how you get around, these are the crises and the things that we're focusing on initially. And it is immediately a collaborative environment with us so that when we hit the ground, we hit it running. So without those partnerships, we would have a hard time figuring out the context of what's going on. Hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it. Sir.
Hello, my name is Cadet Second Class John Paul Stolley, and my question for you is, as a junior that's currently putting in his preferences for jobs, what capabilities can I develop as a cadet and future officer to be of use to these humanitarian efforts, and how can I get involved once I am in the big Air Force, as we say?
What's your first name?
John Paul.
John Paul. Thank you for that question. It's fantastic. We are looking for enthusiasm and people who are interested in supporting us or being part of us. By and large, I talked about unique capabilities or unique capacity. For us, it is really a logistics game. The international community even sees it as a logistics game. The WFP, World Food Program, who recently won the Nobel Peace Prize, is a huge logistics capacity because it opens up and it empowers everybody to do. That is by and large where we see probably 80% of DoD capabilities going in humanitarian crisis. So that could be that you are running on the tarmac with a CRG. It could be that you're offloading and transloading. But something in that space, in the logistics space, will empower you to hopefully support us one day. And certainly if you want to come and do this in the private sector, I know WFP and many others are looking for people with strong logistics capabilities. So that's one great example. We can talk offline. I can give you some other smaller examples as well. For a civilian side, there's a number of websites that you can look at that rank NGOs and organizations that do this work. And they're so diverse. If you as an individual want to help one particular sector, or what we call cluster in the humanitarian community, I realize what cluster means to the DoD, but that's what we call it. You can actually really narrow your scope. So if you're really into logistics, fantastic. If you care about women's health, fantastic. Do you want to do communications? We've got a whole sector that does that as well. Early childhood education, health, you name it. So you sort of need to narrow down what you want to do, and then you go onto a website like Charity Navigator, and you look for that NGO that does that thing. Organizations like Charity Navigator actually rate and rank some of the NGOs so you know whether you're working with a legitimate organization, and then you put in your application. And you show the enthusiasm that you showed just asking the question, because that's what we're looking for. You can learn this job by doing it. But you got to have the enthusiasm all the way through. So thank you, John Paul, for your question. I think it's a great one.
Thank you.
Amen.
Hello, sir. Cadet Third Class Harris, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Sure.
And my question is, when you showed us the map earlier of all the countries that typically need humanitarian aid, I would assume that a lot of those countries are pretty dangerous for Americans to travel to. And so I'd like to ask about how you all prepare for potential threats from local violent groups, and what does the response look like if you all do face violence or aggression from the local population while you're there?
Sure. I'm going to take that question in two ways. One as part of the US government, and two as part of the humanitarian community. First of all, I fall under Chief of Mission Authority with USAID. That means the regional security officer at the embassy dictates where and when we move. Post Benghazi, it has been a much more restricted profession. So ultimately, we don't necessarily have say on whether we can or cannot go out, but I will tell you that I deployed to Lebanon during the port explosions, and that was an insecure environment, and we were heavily restricted. But in more permissive environments, that regional security officer works with us to see where we really need to go to engage. If we can't, as Americans, go out into the field because of some security concern, I go back to those partnerships, that first question that I talked about, right? Because they are often local hires, NGOs, international organizations that we're funding, and this is an unclassed world. Understand that any information that I have, I'm going to give to the host nation, I'm going to give to the NGOs. If you come and work with us, please don't classify your documents. We need to share the information. So we're going to work around those security issues by working oftentimes remotely through partners or when the RSO allows us in person. The humanitarian community, to answer your question from another angle, as I mentioned, is often local. They can integrate into that population. They understand what roads to go down and not go down, and they can work around that insecurity. But they're also living in it. So that means sometimes they just can't get away from it. So that's the best answer I can give you. I hope that helps.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hello, yes, sir. I was wondering, has the quality of aid product delivered for feeding purposes improved? I've read some articles that during the Haiti earthquakes, they were delivering Pop-Tarts and yoga mats, and I was wondering if professional community, the commercial community, has stepped up to create the products that people really need.
Yeah, so I would say that the quality of product has always been there. There are those that will rush into humanitarian situations and bring whatever they have, which often is not appropriate. I think we have done a really good job of educating others that are coming into this community about what right looks like so that we can actually get the right products, because some of these things can be dangerous if you use them in the wrong way. And I hate to say this, but that Pop-Tart is a perfect example. I will not tell you where I've seen recent events that are similar, but it continues to happen, but in one-offs. And the only thing that we can do is jump on those quickly and say, this is not how we do business and this is why. And understand that this is what we do and how we do it. So this is a long tail of sort of education for the community. It's why we engage the DoD on a very regular basis through our Joint Humanitarian Operations course, so that those young officers understand what best practice looks like as they get to more senior and decision-making positions. But it's true across not just the US government, it's the private sector. It's all those new actors that are coming in who think this is a cool, sexy job to be in. And we just have to make them understand how best practice works and what it looks like. But you were spot on to call out the fact that we deal with a lot of entities coming in thinking they understand what should be done when they don't actually know. So thank you for pointing that out.
Appreciate it.
Hello, sir. My name is Dr. Justin Stoddard. I work here in the Center for Character and Leadership Development. And as I look through the news and notice the map of the various humanitarian aid crises that exist all over the world, it seems like some make the press and some don't.
Yeah.
And perhaps even been noticing really lately Sudan. There's a lot of things going on there, but we don't see a lot of that in the press.
Yeah.
Can you speak as to how you prioritize or how USAID prioritizes some of these threats and why you think some of them hit the news and some of them don't?
I'm going to take those backwards. You know, I think there's an exhaustion to crisis. For those of us that work in it, and honestly those that receive it, right? You see things happen on the news, and okay, I got it, it's happening. It doesn't affect me day to day, why do I care? And so after a while, that headline goes to page 2, page 3, page 4, because people are exhausted. I can tell you, even inside of the US government, as we had the Ebola outbreak, when we were doing sort of after-action discussion, how do we prepare for this next time? There were a lot of people who just said, we just need a break from biologicals. Let's talk about something else, right? So there is that exhaustion with what we do. Aid prioritizes our mission based on where we see need and opportunity, right? Disasters are not determined by how many people are dead, but how many people we can actually help. And there is political persuasion. We're part of the US government, but our job is to advocate for best practice and where we see the most benefit to the person we're trying to help and the most benefit to the community at large. So we are in constant conversation with our leadership about what we think is priority. We hear and take in their advice or direction on what they believe is priority, and we often find a middle ground where we're doing as much as we can. But we don't leave a lot of these alone. We're responding 70 times a year. Those are a lot of disasters. And at one point, you know, the most disasters we'd ever seen at a time was 2 or 3, and now we're seeing 6, 7, 8 that we're responding to. We have taken on, inside of BHA at USAID, a very heavy burden of responses in crises, right? 70 times a year is a lot. So I think we're doing our best to prioritize with the persuasions and the guidance that we're getting, but it is also exceptionally challenging because we're just overwhelmed with how much is going on. Those protracted crises are lasting longer and longer. The natural disasters with climate adaptation seem to be occurring more frequently. And we've gone from a bureau that used to be about 500 million, 600 million when I started, to 10, 11 billion dollars a year. So it's not that we're sort of picking and choosing, we're just taking on more and working our best to prioritize with our leadership. Hope that's okay.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Hello, my name is CC Webb, and my question is, what disasters are harder to help with, natural disasters or man-made?
I'm going to go with the subcategories. I think it's a fantastic question. Atypical, if you can say typical. Again, they're snowflakes, right? They're all different. But typically rapid onset disasters, right, those natural disasters, are permissive environments. They're people going through crisis and they just need help. And when you go in, they often welcome you. And it doesn't take too long for them to get back on their feet or at least be stabilized. So you can go in for a couple of weeks, a couple of months in most cases, provide aid, depart on good terms, and if there's another disaster, you can always come back. It's not a win, but it feels like you have produced something. Complex emergencies, civil wars, protracted crises are hard. I talked about morale in this community. When you go into a crisis, a civil war, you don't know when it's going to end. And sometimes your day doesn't look like, yay, we fixed it. It looks like, well, we didn't make it worse today. And we might be here for the next 10, 20 years doing this. So I will tell you from an emotional perspective, a personal perspective, complex emergencies are hard because you don't know where the end is. And the end doesn't look good, no matter what way you cut it. So I'll go with man-made complex emergencies as my answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it.
If there are no other questions, I think we would be all remiss to not thank Whitney and Weston for bearing with us throughout this week. Whitney is with his 5-month-old right now and taking care of him. So I just wanted to thank her for bearing with all of us. Oren, thank you again for your time today. Your experiences and presentation truly embody our theme of valuing human conditions, cultures, and societies. On behalf of the U.S. Air Force Academy and our National Character and Leadership Symposium, please accept this token of our gratitude. The base of this gift is made out of marble from our terrazzo. This is foundational to us because all of our cadets loved running the marble strips during their freshman year. We hope you will look on this and remember your NCLS experience fondly.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, thank you. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it. I'm more than happy to chat with people afterwards if you have any questions, or certainly if you have questions going into the future. Kelly can always provide my information, and I'm happy to engage. So thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. Cheers.
This concludes our session. Please share your immediate feedback on the NCLS app. Select this session and click on the Rate Session button. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.